October 1977. The Speakeasy Club, London. Jimmy Page was deep into an impromptu jam session with a handful of musicians when something impossible happened. The intimate crowd of maybe 150 people packed into the smoky basement venue suddenly stopped watching the stage. Heads turned toward the entrance. Whispers rippled through the room like electricity. Page, lost in a bluesy guitar solo, felt the shift in energy and opened his eyes. Standing in the doorway, still wearing his silver flight jacket from the transatlantic journey, makeup smudged from exhaustion, was Ace Frehley. What happened next became one of rock and roll's most treasured secrets. A night that those 150 people would carry with them forever. Even though no cameras captured it, no journalists documented it. And the story remained hidden in the shadows of rock history for decades. It was October 15th, 1977, a Saturday night in London's West End. The Speakeasy Club on Margaret Street was the kind of place where real musicians came after their official gigs ended. Down a narrow staircase, through a heavy door, into a basement that smelled of cigarette smoke, spilled beer, and possibility. The club held 150 people if you squeezed them in, and tonight it was beyond capacity. Jimmy Page wasn't scheduled to be there. He'd finished Led Zeppelin's European tour dates 2 weeks earlier and was supposed to be at his home in Sussex, resting before the next leg. But Page had always been a creature of the night, drawn to the underground music scene, the spontaneous sessions where ego dissolved and pure musicianship took over. Tonight he'd shown up around midnight with just his black Gibson Les Paul plugged into a borrowed Marshall amp and started playing. The crowd recognized him immediately, but this wasn't a concert. This was church. People didn't scream or rush the stage. They listened. They watched a master at work. Page was playing loose, exploratory, letting his fingers find spaces between blues and something darker, something that wouldn't fit on a Led Zeppelin record. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, 30,000 feet above the dark water, Ace Frehley was wide awake in a first-class seat, staring out the window at nothing. Kiss had just wrapped a punishing American tour. 73 cities in 4 months. The makeup, the pyrotechnics, the screaming crowds, the persona of Space Ace. It was everything he'd ever wanted, and lately it was crushing him. The band had 3 days off before they started pre-production on their solo albums. That's right, solo albums. All 4 members simultaneously. It was unprecedented, ambitious, and Ace could feel the cracks forming in Kiss's foundation. Gene and Paul were already acting like this was a competition rather than an opportunity. Peter was drinking more, and Ace was somewhere between exhausted and lost. He'd booked the London flight on impulse, told no one. Not the band, not management, not even his wife. He just needed to disappear for 48 hours to remember what it felt like to be Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx instead of Space Ace from the Kiss Army. London seemed far enough away. He checked into a hotel in Soho under a false name, showered, but couldn't sleep. The adrenaline from months of touring was still coursing through him. Around 11 p.m., he asked the concierge where musicians went in London. The answer came without hesitation. The Speakeasy. Ace arrived just after midnight, still wearing the silver jacket he'd worn on the plane. His makeup partially removed, but still visible around his eyes like war paint he couldn't quite wash off. He paid the cover charge to a doorman who clearly recognized him, but said nothing. Then he descended into the basement. The first thing Ace heard was Jimmy Page's guitar. That unmistakable tone. Thick, saturated, howling through a Marshall stack like a voice from somewhere deep and ancient. Ace stopped on the stairs, actually physically stopped, because the sound hit him like a wave. This wasn't Paige playing a Led Zeppelin song. This was Paige channeling something raw and unfinished. Ace reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. The club was packed. Bodies pressed together, all facing a small stage where Jimmy Page stood alone under a single spotlight, his Les Paul slung low, his eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music flowing through him. For about 3 minutes, Ace just watched. He'd met Page once, briefly, backstage at Madison Square Garden in 1975. They'd exchanged maybe 10 words, mostly about Les Paul guitars. But Ace had always considered Page one of the untouchables, a guitarist from a different stratosphere. And here he was, playing in a basement for people who just happened to show up. Then someone near the bar recognized Ace. The whisper started. Within 30 seconds, that whisper had spread through the entire room. People weren't screaming, but they were turning, staring, pointing. The intimate atmosphere of musicians respecting a master at work suddenly became charged with a different energy. Jimmy Page felt it before he saw it, that shift that happens when attention divides. He opened his eyes mid-phrase and saw the crowd looking backward toward the entrance instead of at him. Page's fingers continued playing on autopilot while his mind processed what was happening. Then he saw the silver jacket, the distinctive silhouette, the smudged remains of silver makeup. Page stopped playing. The sudden silence was shocking. His backing musicians, a drummer and bassist he'd invited up from the crowd, stumbled to a halt. Page stepped forward to the edge of the small stage, squinting past the spotlight. What Jimmy Page said next would be repeated in hushed tones by everyone in that basement for the rest of their lives. Well, Space Ace just landed in London. The crowd erupted, but it was a controlled eruption. Applause, laughter, but not chaos. These were music people. They understood the unspoken rules of a place like the Speakeasy. Ace raised a hand in acknowledgement, clearly uncomfortable with disrupting Page's session, and tried to fade back into the crowd. But Page wasn't having it. He unplugged his guitar, walked to the edge of the stage, and pointed directly at Ace. "You didn't fly across the Atlantic to stand in the back, mate. Get up here." Ace shook his head, trying to wave off the invitation, but the crowd was already parting, creating a path from the door to the stage. Page was standing there with his arms crossed, waiting, a slight smile on his face. The entire club was watching. Ace made his way through the crowd. People touched his shoulder as he passed, nodding, understanding somehow that something special was about to happen. When he reached the stage, Page extended his hand and pulled him up. They stood face to face for a moment. Two guitarists from opposite sides of the rock spectrum. Page, the blues mystic, the studio architect, the wizard of Led Zeppelin. Frehley, the street kid from the Bronx, the space-age showman, the wild card of Kiss. Different worlds, different approaches, but something in their eyes said they recognized each other. "What are you doing in London, Ace?" Page asked, his voice picked up by the stage microphone. Ace laughed, surprised by his own honesty. "Running away, I think." The crowd chuckled. Page nodded slowly, like he understood more than Ace had said. "I know that feeling. Well, you picked a good place to hide." He gestured to the borrowed Les Paul in the guitar stand. "You play one of these, don't you?" Ace looked at the guitar. It was similar to his own, Black Gibson Les Paul Custom, the instrument that had become his signature. Yeah, I might remember how. Page handed him the guitar. The weight of it, the familiar curve of the body against his ribs, it grounded Ace in a way nothing had for months. This was real. This was honest. No makeup, no costume, no choreographed pyrotechnics. Just wood and strings and amplifiers. "What do you want to play?" Page asked. Ace thought for a moment. He could feel the club's collective anticipation. "You know, Since I've Been Loving You." Page's eyebrows rose. That was a deep cut. A Led Zeppelin song that showcased Page's blues prowess. It wasn't an obvious choice. "That's a tough one." "I know," Ace said. "That's why I want to try it." Page smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "All right, let's see what you've got, Space Ace." What happened next was magic. Pure, unexpected, unrehearsable magic. Page counted off, and they launched into the song. Page took the main melody, his fingers dancing across the fretboard with that signature fluidity. Ace found the spaces between, adding texture, filling gaps, complementing rather than competing. The sound they created together was unlike anything either had done with their respective bands. It was bluesy but spacey, grounded but cosmic. Page's mystical approach and Ace's streetwise instincts somehow merged into something entirely new. The crowd was mesmerized. People later said it was like watching two completely different languages somehow form a perfect conversation. Page would play a phrase, and Ace would respond with something unexpected, but absolutely right. They weren't just playing together. They were listening to each other, reacting, building something spontaneous and unrepeatable. When the song ended, the basement exploded with applause. People were on their feet, shouting, whistling. Page and Ace stood there, both breathing hard, both grinning like they'd just gotten away with something illegal. "That was brilliant," Page said, barely audible over the crowd. Ace nodded, unable to articulate what he was feeling. For the first time in months, he'd played guitar for no reason other than the joy of playing. No costumes, no explosions, no Space Ace persona. Just Paul Daniel Frehley and his guitar, conversing with one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. Page turned to the crowd. "I think we're just getting started." He looked at Ace. "You staying?" Ace laughed. "I don't have anywhere else to be." For the next 2.5 hours, Jimmy Page and Ace Frehley played together in the basement of the Speakeasy Club. They covered blues standards. They jammed on improvised riffs. They played fragments of songs that didn't quite exist yet. Sometimes the bassist and drummer joined in. Sometimes it was just the two of them, guitars intertwining in the dim light. At one point, they attempted Dazed and Confused, but halfway through, it morphed into something neither of them had planned. Page started laughing mid-solo, and Ace joined in. And the whole thing dissolved into chaos before reforming into a completely different structure. They played Strutter, the Kiss song, but stripped down to its blues bones. Page had never heard it before, but he picked up the changes instantly, adding his own serpentine runs between Ace's more straightforward power chord progressions. It was the same song, but transformed, like seeing a familiar building from an angle you'd never noticed before. During a quiet moment between songs, while they were retuning, Ace mentioned his upcoming solo album. The pressure he was feeling, the fear that he couldn't carry a record without the Kiss identity behind him. Page took a long drink from a bottle of beer someone had handed him. "You know what your problem is?" he said, his voice low enough that only Ace could hear. "You think the makeup makes you special, but what I'm hearing tonight, This is who you actually are. This is your voice. The makeup, the explosions, that's just theater. This, he gestured to the guitar in Ace's hands. This is the truth. Ace didn't respond, but something in those words landed deep. He'd been Space Ace for so long that he'd forgotten Paul Frehley existed underneath. Tonight, in a basement in London with no one expecting anything from him, he'd found that person again. They played until almost 3 in the morning. The crowd thinned out slowly, reluctantly, people leaving but looking back over their shoulders like they couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. By the end, maybe 50 people remained, the hardest of the hardcore, the ones who understood they were watching something that would never happen again. The final song they played was a slow blues progression, unplanned, unrehearsed. Page and Ace traded licks back and forth, each phrase a question and answer, a conversation without words. It was intimate, almost private, despite the audience. When it finally wound down to silence, no one applauded immediately. The moment felt too sacred to break. Then Page unplugged his guitar and turned to Ace. They shook hands, then embraced briefly, and Ace could feel the genuine connection there. Not rock stars congratulating each other, but musicians recognizing the real thing. "Come back anytime," Page said. "London's always here." Ace nodded. "Thanks for this. I needed it more than you know." "I know," Page said simply. Ace left the Speakeasy around 3:30 in the morning. A few people stopped him on the street for autographs, but most of the night crawlers in Soho didn't recognize him without the full makeup. He walked back to his hotel through empty streets, his mind clearer than it had been in months. 2 days later, he flew back to New York and dove into his solo album sessions. The confidence he'd gained in that London basement carried through. His solo record, released in 1978, became the biggest seller of all 4 Kiss solo albums, driven largely by New York groove, but also by a bluesy, stripped-down authenticity that surprised critics who'd written him off as just the spaceman. Jimmy Page rarely spoke about that night publicly, but in a 1979 interview with a British music magazine, he mentioned it obliquely. Had a tremendous jam session at the Speakeasy couple years back with an American guitarist. Brilliant player, much better than people give him credit for. Sometimes the best music happens when nobody's planning it. Those who were there that night became custodians of a secret. They'd witnessed something impossible. 2 guitarists from completely different worlds, finding common ground in a basement, creating music that couldn't be categorized or commodified. Some of them took photos, but the lighting was terrible. The images grainy and dark. There's no video, no audio recording, just memories and stories passed down. The Speakeasy Club closed in 1978, but the building still stands on Margaret Street. There's no plaque, no marker indicating what happened there. But if you know where to look, if you dig into the right corners of rock history, you'll find the whispers. The night Ace Frehley walked into a Jimmy Page session and proved he was more than just Space Ace. For Ace, that night became a touchstone. Years later, during his struggles with addiction and his departures and returns to Kiss, he would think about that basement in London. The feeling of playing guitar for no reason other than love of the instrument. No expectations, no persona, no mask, just music. In his 2011 autobiography, Ace devoted a single paragraph to the London session, buried in a chapter about the solo album era. Played with Jimmy Page once in a small club in London. Nobody knew I was there. It was one of the best nights of my life. That's all he wrote. But people who know Ace, who understand what he usually says versus what he actually feels, They know that paragraph carries more weight than entire chapters about platinum records and sold-out arenas. Jimmy Page kept a set list from that night, though calling it a set list is generous. It's just a piece of paper with song titles scrawled in different handwriting, crossed out, amended, with margin notes like Ace's Blues Thing and Strange Tuning Experiment. That paper stayed in Page's collection of memorabilia, not in any public exhibition, but in his private archive. A reminder that sometimes the most meaningful moments happen off the record. The story of that night has grown over the years, as these stories do. Some versions have them playing until dawn. Others claim Robert Plant showed up, or that members of the Rolling Stones were in the crowd. But the truth is simple and perfect enough without embellishment. Two master guitarists from different worlds met in a basement and created something beautiful that existed only in that moment and in the memories of those who witnessed it. It reminds us that before they were legends, before they were Space Ace and the architect of Led Zeppelin's sound, they were kids who fell in love with guitars. And sometimes, in rare moments when the industry and the expectations and the personas fall away, they get to remember what that felt like. To just play. To just connect. To just be musicians in a room with other people who understand. That's what happened on October 15, 1977, in the basement of the Speakeasy Club in London. Ace Frehley walked in trying to escape himself and found himself instead. Jimmy Page, generous and wise, gave him the space to do it. And 150 people got to watch two artists strip away everything except the music and discover they spoke the same language after all.